So, very nice to meet you, Paul. This is the first
Yeah.
time we ever met, I guess.
Yes, I mean we've had emails over the years, haven't we?
Right,
But we never actually talked face to face, or at least
right.
remotely face to face. Yeah.
Okay, it's an honor for me to meet with you. And I'm speaking with Paul Sparks, that you are the one of the most knowledge men in the world about the classical mandolin history. Isn't it right?
Well, it's nice to say so. I mean, certainly in the English-speaking world, there was very little written about it before I started. I just became aware, sort of somewhere around 1980 or so, that I kept coming across references to old pieces of mandolin music, but nobody seemed to have written about it. And so I just started as my postgraduate work initially, just looking at the 18th century in Paris mainly and the popularity of the mandolin there. And then it just kind of, snowballed on really. And I tried my best to write an entire history, obviously with James Tyler part of it as well, who was incredibly knowledgeable on the very early mandolins.
So that is, that was the turning point for the ancient mandolin knowledge, the mandolin history, when that book came out. Yeah, let's talk about that. That was the early mandolin. It was 1989.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And how did it come? Actually,
well,
let us know something before this. How did it come for you to step on the mandolin? Why you are so interested into the mandolin?
Well, partly when I was about 11 or so, I was aware I'd just been visiting some friends who'd lived in the same house. Their families had lived in the same house for generations. I noticed that quite often they had an old mandolin up in the attic somewhere, and nobody played it, but they all said, "Oh yes, my grandmother used to play it." And it struck me as odd, I mean, why sort of around 1900 this would have been, why so many women at that time in particular seemed to have played the mandolin, and then it was forgotten. I mean, when I was growing up, the only mandolins you came across were really in like Fairport Convention, folk groups.
Was it a bowback mandolin or flatback mandolin?
These were bowback mandolins.
Bowback.
And usually made in Naples or somewhere in sort of 1890, 1900 around
Catania,
there.
Yes.
And there seemed to be a lot of them. And so I was in the back of my mind after that, wondering why there had been so many mandolins and nobody seemed to have a recollection of it now or to have written about it. And then, slightly strange thing, partly I was a classical guitarist and
okay.
I was working quite good, but I realized people like John Williams and Julian Bream were in a different league really to me. So partly it was a practical thing as a performing musician thinking, I noticed that there's quite a lot of mandolin parts in Mahler symphonies and Mozart's Don Giovanni and many things. And there were very few people around at that time to play them. So partly I sort of, it was an enlightened self-interest that I sort of started playing the mandolin because I could get work with orchestras doing that.
Okay.
But I became just more and more interested in the instrument itself and wondering why there wasn't, a proper history written of it. I didn't at that time realize I was going to end up writing it, but
of course,
I just wanted to find out more initially.
Of course. And so you were self-taught, or you had the chance to learn from somebody?
There was a mandolin player in London called Hugo Dalton, who from about the end of World War II onwards had been almost the only classical mandolin player.
Right.
And he turns up. I mean, I quite often hear old films and things, and he's there on the soundtrack of them. So he was a very good player. And I studied with him for a couple of years. He was quite an eccentric man. He was not always that easy to get on with, but he knew a lot. And those of us who studied with him, I don't know if you knew Alison Stevens, but she studied with him.
Also with him. So you were based in London then?
Yes. Well, I was living in Brighton, but that's still quite near London, so I would study with him. And also then I was at university, and then I wanted to write a PhD. And my music department, nobody there knew anything about the mandolin, so somebody knew somebody who knew James Tyler and said, perhaps he'd be a good external supervisor for you to have. as he already was investigating early mandolins. And so I initially had James as my supervisor, but we got on very well. And he was less interested in the Neapolitan mandolin. I mean, he was interested in all instruments, but he was more interested in the early kind of, six-course mandolins. And so our interests kind of dovetailed very nicely.
I see. And so it became, in that moment, you was building the idea of writing that book for Oxford Press.
Yes, gradually it grew as my research came on, and he was doing more research as well. He'd already written a couple of articles in the Early Music Journal in about 1981, I think, which sort of covered some of the music, but he'd been investigating more. And we just realized that we could, between us, we had the makings of a good book that would cover the mandolin from the 16th century through to about the beginning of the 19th century.
It's unbelievable. That book is still now, and the most important source of for mandolin archives and music repertoire. So
that's really nice to know. And I mean, it's great because Jim died quite 12, 13 years ago, or 11 or 12 years ago now. So I mean, it's great to know that his memory sort of lives on in that work. And you don't know when you're doing something like that. I mean, I was aware that this hadn't been covered before, but a lot of the time you don't quite know where it's going to lead. It's just lucky. But I mean, it's really nice to write a book that more than 30 years later is still of relevance to people.
Sure. So, and what is important to say is that before that, there was totally nothing. So it came out of the blue, and now it's still the best reference. That's great. And you made this difference between the two terminologies.
Yeah. Well, used. I mean, this only works in the English language, and I'm aware it annoyed some people, and I can see their point actually, that we used the 5 or 6 course early mandolin we called mandolino, mainly because most of its repertoire is from Italian sources, or a lot of it is. And then we use mandolin with an E on the end, the French spelling, for the 18th century Neapolitan mandolin, because most of the music we have, or an awful lot from that period, most of the published music is from Paris.
And back in those times, they were calling it, either in England, they were calling it with the E, final E?
Mostly, when I was growing up, the spelling was just IN at the end. If you look back at 19th, sort of Victorian English, they quite often did have an E on the end, but it sort of dropped off about 1900 in most spelling.
Yeah, that's cool.
Went the same as the American spelling of mandolin.
Right, yes.
But obviously, I mean, the problem was actually when you come across references to the mandolin in English, most of the time it didn't matter which sort they were talking about, because mostly the people didn't know really. They just said mandolin, and they meant any kind of small plucked instrument, really.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously in Italian, you're going to have mandolino, whether it's Neapolitan or one from the north of Italy.
Regional
France,
differences.
you're going to get the E basically. But what we thought in the book was simply we'd have to keep writing, Milanese mandolin, Neapolitan mandolin, and if you're doing that in an entire book about the mandolin, you end up writing that about 1,000 times, and it's quite irritating. So we just thought that was a convenient way of distinguishing between the two. But I'm aware there are lots and lots of exceptions. I mean, there's plenty of Italian sources. But
either back in those times, they were each one were calling it in a different way, in its own way. Of course, this is normal. This is normal, and so it was quite not popular when you started to play the mandolin back in those times in England. But as you said, also the American culture was coming to UK.
Yes. I mean, so bluegrass obviously was very important. Here, what's called the English folk revival. I mean, it's not exactly folk music, but it was acoustic music. I mean, Fairport Convention are probably one of the most well-known internationally from the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, they had some good mandolin playing in there.
Right.
And you would come across it, but it was much more a sort of folk club instrument for when I first encountered it. Yeah. And obviously usually a flatback, I mean, a Gibson or something like that.
Right. It became very, very popular in Irish music as well, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And particularly they use, in Irish music, you get mandolin, but you quite often get sort of mandolas, or even sort of adapted Eastern European instruments. I mean, I think quite a lot of sort of things that probably originated in Greece with quite long necks have ended up in Irish music. Because they like that sort of deeper sound.
Yeah, the bouzouki became a sort of traditional instrument for Irish music, and then the mandolin. But they use a sort of their own made shape of mandolin. So it's not a ball back. Never was a ball back, but is neither the American flat back. Is like an Irish kind of mandolin. That's interesting that our instrument is so changed and invent new shapes for different genres. What?
Oh, well, it's one thing. I mean, I'm also involved with sort of guitar history to some extent, and trying to define, what is a mandolin or what is a guitar is very difficult, because there are things that seem to have almost nothing in common with each other. I mean, I don't want to get too abstract, but, Plato somewhere talks about, the archetypal chair, doesn't he? I mean, what is it about an arrangement that makes it a chair, so that you can look at an armchair or a little wooden chair and you still know it's a chair? And the same with the mandolin. I think the principle is just it's a high-pitched, plucked instrument. But within that, I mean, there are hundreds of different forms, some of which we wouldn't call a mandolin, but and the same with guitar. I mean, almost anything with strings strung across it that's sort of plucked or struck. Or
That is interesting. Yes, that is the anthropology of the mandolin.
Well, organology it's called, isn't it?
Organology, yes.
And I mean, organology, yes, it's a pursuit in its own. It's almost like, sort of being people who decide on dinosaurs or whatever, sort of that this is a different species to that, and there's no clear gradation. I mean, I don't know where the difference between a guitar and a mandolin is clear most of the time, but there are some instances where I'm not sure you could call it one or the other, or you could call it a lute.
Sure. Yeah, that is. Those are big topics, of course, for
yes, probably outside
academic discussions. So, Paul, what do you think about the situation of the mandolin? I mean, we can, since you know everything, all the documents, all the sources, what was the situation back in the 1800s compared with the late 1900s, early 20th century, and early 21st century, I mean, and compared to nowadays? The global, the world situation of the mandolin is in a big trend now, in classical music, but also in different genres. So the trend is growing up very much. Italy, and so what was and what is the situation, in your opinion, in London and UK?
But looking back to 1800 or so, or in
I mean, back seeing and reading your papers, we can tell that back in the 1800s, 18th century, sorry, so 1700s, right? Back in the 18th century.
I know in Italian, because you say Ottocento, don't you? But it's actually 1700. Yeah.
So in the Baroque era, it was a big deal with all Italians that were there playing the mandolin. And again, early of the 1900s, wow, it was an amazing big deal. We will see the documentary we are producing. We will see that it's amazing that the huge level of diffusion, maybe you say, of spreading of the instrument around. So there were golden ages. So compare those periods, if we can make a very brief comparison.
Well, if I look at, I mean, one thing I've been aware of is all these instruments, they're played as folk instruments, and they're just part of ordinary people's lives, quite often, particularly in Italy, these instruments. And whether or not, people publish music for them or write about them, that's more about whether I think the middle classes start to become aware of them. But I think, there are fashions that go in and out where the instrument gets into the concert hall or isn't in the concert hall. But I think on streets and just in people's rooms, they always had a sort of level of popularity. The same with the guitar. That there's an idea that the guitar for a lot of the 19th century wasn't very popular, but in Spain in particular, I mean, and Italy for that matter, I mean, I think it was just you'd probably have found one in every other house, really. But I think if we look at the period sort of 1750 to 1800, I mean, in Paris in particular, it became an instrument sort of the aristocracy took up, and particularly because it was the new Neapolitan mandolin, which is tuned like a violin, which meant you had the advantage if you could play the violin, then it wasn't hard to adapt your technique to being able to play the mandolin. And that became quite a significant musical instrument, with quite a lot of music published. And also, one has to be aware of sort of fashion accessory at times as well. It turns up in paintings, a lot of portraits of particularly women, because they're quite elegant instruments. Then, and obviously,
and also you have the painting of the princess that is playing the mandolin early.
Madame de Pompadour, in particular, who was Louis XV's mistress, and she was a very significant figure. She was a real fashion trendsetter in Paris.
So she was an important testimonial for the instrument, for the
around
trend.
The time that painting, the painting was actually done posthumously of her, but the fact that the mandolin's there as one of her accomplishments in the picture, I think that's the time when you start to see much more music being published and more Italian teachers setting up in Paris, which obviously indicates there was a lucrative market of people who wanted to learn.
So that what dates we could say?
That's from the 1760s and the 1770s in particular in Paris.
Right.
I think that was the most significant time when a great deal of music's published. A lot of mandolin methods are published as well.
Right.
A little bit later, sort of in 1800, 1810s in Vienna, and also in Prague, you find that it was certainly a popular instrument there as well, again with the sort of middle classes and parts of the aristocracy. Then there seems to have been, as far as sort of general awareness amongst what you might call the cultured classes. I don't like to use that term very much, but the sort of people who wrote reviews in newspapers and magazines and so on. There seems to have been a dip for a lot of the 19th century, and the instrument wasn't encountered so often in the concert hall. It was occasionally people like McCarthy and Beilati toured around Europe and were quite successful, but he didn't find it that commonly. And then certainly, I think sounds like your documentary's going to talk about this, the Italian diaspora, really, that after the unification of Italy, there was a great exodus of Italians, it seems, that, to the United States, well, to South America as well, and to most European countries. There seemed to have been a huge number of Italians. And my theory is certainly partly because the mandolin is small and portable. If you're going to get on a ship and go off to have a new life, it's a bit of home that you can take with you, because it's not very big, for one thing. And so I think you find a lot of Italians settling all over the major cities all over Europe and in North America as well. And they started teaching to other people. And in England, which I probably know the situation best here, from the sort of 1880s onwards, it became phenomenally popular, particularly with women, partly because women, playing music wasn't quite a respectable profession at that time. You had women in the theatre, but if you were a sort of respectable, from a respectable middle class family, you couldn't go and play the violin in an orchestra, in a professional orchestra. Women just weren't allowed until early in the 20th century. But for the sort of Victorian culture, thought that guitars and mandolins were, by the standards of the day, were sort of ladylike instruments, and that women could perform on these. And you started in the 1880s and 1890s to get hundreds of mandolin bands all over England, almost entirely female.
Hundreds?
Oh, hundreds and hundreds. Almost every town would have had at least one, and London had loads.
At least, one.
And in particular, there's quite a well-known picture of one band, the Polytechnic Mandolin and Guitar Orchestra, that was taken outside Crystal Palace, where there's over 100
that's
women.
Amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
That's
and that
really
was
astonishing.
But there were others, many that had several dozen members. And they were playing a mixture of sort of, kind of Neapolitan songs transcribed and the light classics and some sort of light dance music. But occasionally they'd do some quite serious, sort of more heavyweight pieces as well. I mean, occasionally symphonies and, entire acts of operas and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these were of a good standard because quite a lot of the women, there were a lot of music colleges set up like the Royal College of Music and Trinity College in London. These all started up in the 1880s and had a lot of women students there. So you're having all these very well-trained women coming out. They didn't learn mandolin there. They learned piano and singing, but then they couldn't do anything with the skills they'd acquired. So I think a lot of them sort of thought, well, if we set up guitar and mandolin bands, we can go out and play. We can raise money for charity, which was also considered a very good thing. And so without compromising the sort of respectable status of the middle class. And I mean, that may sound a bit quaint now, but in Victorian times, being respectable is very important. And so you had to be very careful not to do things. The idea of a woman playing the cello in public, for instance, with her legs apart would have been absolutely verboten at the time. It would just
verboten. Okay, yes. So, wow, that was a huge deal back in those times. So what about nowadays, London and England? What do you think about that? Because, for example, we just saw the soundtrack of Backpuss. I don't know if you are familiar. Yeah, but, this is an element of the costume that were back in those times. The mandolin was around, was played, and so you having the soundtrack of that popular TV show. So and many other occasions, of course. So what is nowadays, in your opinion?
I mean, from most of the 20th century, I'd say the period from sort of, I mean, it's probably happened all over the world, really, that as radio and recorded music has come in and it's possible to hear other people playing something very well, that the desire of the average person to master an instrument has got less. So I think whereas it's, say, in the 1920s, probably, most people tried at least to play an instrument. They may not have played it very well, but something like a mandolin or a guitar is a sort of instrument that they might have learnt, or the piano. There's been a gradual decline. We used to have an organisation called, well, we still do, called the BMG, the Banjo, Mandolin and Guitar Federation, which was very big at times. I mean, you can see newsreels
glorious
1940s.
Association.
And that they could fill big town halls and have national competitions. They're still going, but it's I think it's fair to say it's a lot smaller these days than it was at its height, say 60, 70 years ago. But I think that just reflects society, really, that there are fewer people who want to sort of put in the dedicated hours. But it's when I started being interested in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there seemed to be very few people really playing, and I have the feeling it's better in England now. And I mean, it may also be I've developed contacts, of course, so I know about more people than I did then.
So it is growing in UK as well, of course.
Yes, I think it is generally, and in America, it seems like there are more people being active now. I mean, I have the feeling when I first made contact with people in America, it often seemed like it was people from the Italian tradition, whose grandparents had migrated to the United States, and it kind of kept on as a cultural thing. But I have a feeling now it's a lot of people with no Italian connections now who just play that music if they like it, and so a lot of those bands are still going. And then, of course, bluegrass and jazz and so on.
Now we have all the influences. Yes, we have to remember also that the mandolin in UK was played very much by the rock bands, because Roger Waters used it. Actually, I know you are an expert. Maybe you worked for some documentaries for BBC. Isn't it right?
Well, I do in my other capacity. I'm part of a television company, so we make documentaries. I mean, we've made a lot over the years. I've never actually made one about the mandolin.
We should do it.
Well, you always have to, get somebody at the BBC to give you the money to make it. So it's, I've never been able to.
I was pointing to this because I stepped in the fact that Roger Waters wrote the soundtrack for a BBC documentary on the body. So if you listen for the album Music from the Body by Roger Waters of the Pink Floyd, there is the use of mandolin. Actually, it seems like a mandolin orchestra. They were, playing with multiple plucked instruments. So you feel like a mandolin orchestra in those tracks. And that was a documentary by the BBC. And also Led Zeppelin, of course, they use the mandolin for some riffs. And so, yeah.
Well, it turns up, and yes, I mean, a lot of groups, I mean, a few groups actually sort of had mandolin. I mean, I mentioned Fairport Convention because mandolin was pretty much a standard part of their lineup, but a lot of other groups, yes, it's just sort of somebody would play it on a few tracks here and there. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of, there's certainly a greater awareness of it than there was, say 40 years ago. Really, I'm not sure if you ask the average person that they'd be that familiar with the fact that there are the sort of Gibson, carved top and sides instruments, the flat back ones and the round backs and so on. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of that.
I don't think so.
When I talk to folk mandolinists, they're a bit disparaging about round back instruments. I think that's partly the problem because a lot of those round back instruments that were made, say in the 1890s in Naples and other parts of Italy, I think
low quality.
Over the years, they've had heavy strings put on them, and it's pulled the neck out of shape. And so people, when they try and play them, they think they're out of tune. And
yes.
And of course, it's not that. It's just the fact that the instrument's not set up properly.
And so let's speak about what's on now for you. Do you have any project after making the documentary for the mandolin on BBC? No,
well,
what's on for you now?
I mean, I had it's a tragic, obviously from in every way that Alison Stevens died when she did, because I was sort of getting ready for thinking because what I wanted to do was make a documentary about this phenomenon of the ladies' mandolin and guitar bands in the 1890s and 1900s. And, I wanted to get a few women mandolinists and a guitarist together to be a little band. And because they would often dress up in Italian national costume as well, these bands in London. And, that was because Italy was very, very, very popular. I mean, anything to do with Italy in the 1890s, 1900s did very well here. So I still hope one day to be able to make a documentary about that, because I think as well as a musical thing, it's just kind of sociological, rather interesting phenomenon.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, apart from that, my research in recent years has been sort of more about the guitar, really. I'm a member of a guitar consortium of historians at Cambridge. And so that obviously a lot of my interest in there. Although I do try and publish stuff about the mandolin as well. I think the last article I published was the mandolin in 18th century England, which I published a couple of years ago now. Just sort of, looking at it wasn't as widely played in England as it was in France in the 18th century, but it was quite widely played, particularly between about 1750 and 1800.
Sure. Okay, so we are looking forward to see the documentary. And thank you very much for. Yeah, it was very nice.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable.